Cale! Here's Clark. Who? Who's this guy?
Cale, it must be a happy day for you, eh?
Welcome to the Cale Clark Show. Another fresh episode for you, coming at you on YouTube podcasts, on Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts as well. As always, I'm joined by producer Lucas Holt. Lucas, it's time for the ritual. You know what time it is. What are you rocking tonight? What are we going to crack open?
Well, I've got my Coke Zero, Cale, which
Okay,
I figured
Coke
you
Zero.
would appreciate. I may be in a conversion process from Diet Coke to Coke Zero, so
It's not the first time
see.
you've converted. So, yeah, you're familiar with the long and winding road,
Yeah,
the
what do you
emotional
got?
ups and downs. I'm rocking actually a Dr. Pepper Zero Sugar. I love the taste of
Okay.
Dr. Pepper, I got to tell you. All right, so let's the ritual, shall we? 3,
All right.
2, 1. All right. Wow, yours is
Cheers.
crisp. Mine was a little, I don't know, maybe it's stale. I don't know, but cheers. Okay. Wow. Well, Lucas, we have a lot to talk about today. It's been an incredible week on many fronts, but I want to talk about specifically, and you know the show is about faith, facts, and fun. I want to talk specifically about a major faith-based discovery, a scientific, I guess you could say a little bit more scientific ammunition, and it's all about the Shroud of Turin and its authenticity. And Lucas, you and I were both, of course, at the National Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis, and I'm sure you saw this. I don't know if you saw this, but I certainly saw this. One of the things that they had there was a replica of the Shroud of Turin. And it wasn't the real thing, but it was a replica. And you know how we Catholics, we love our relics. And when it comes to potentially a relic involving Jesus himself, especially authenticating not only his existence, but his death, his burial, and maybe even his resurrection. We'll talk about that in a second. The Shroud of Turin has always captured people's imaginations. And I got to tell you, Lucas, I don't know if you saw the lineups, but they were 10, 12 wide.
Yeah.
And they were hundreds deep. I mean, the lineup to get in to see the replica of the Shroud took hours. I did not go in. I have to confess, I didn't take the time to line up to see this, but many hundreds did, and that was really incredible to me to see the line snaking through the entire Indiana Convention Center, and it was pretty wild.
So yeah, we were actually, my wife and I were planning on going, but we had our 2-year-old son with us, and we were like, yeah, let's go check this out. It'd be really cool. And then I saw the lens, and I was like, oh, this is going to take a while. I don't know if he's going to be able to hold on.
Yeah,
but it was cool to
exactly.
see that many people. Obviously, there's something about the Shroud that, like you said, captures people's imagination and is a very fascinating artifact. And to be honest, I actually don't know a whole lot about it. So I'm looking forward to this episode and kind of being able to dive in a little bit here and see what it's all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you probably have heard, Lucas, it's been pretty common in recent years and recent decades for people to say that the Shroud of Turin was a medieval fake. Right. And the reason why that is often said is because there were some elements of the Shroud that were examined in recent years that were found to be from medieval times, about 7 centuries ago. However, those patches of the Shroud were not part of the original Shroud. They were actually sewn onto the Shroud because the Shroud, of course, was damaged in a major fire. And it was sort of, some pieces were added to make it look square again. But those pieces were added during medieval times. And they are, of course, from the 13th or 14th century, I believe. But the Shroud itself, there's always been some pretty good evidence that it is, in fact, a first century artifact from the time of Christ. But now we have even more that has come out just over the past week. Some incredible scientific research has been released. We'll tell you what that is all about in just a second. But when it comes to the Shroud, I was very fortunate in my academic career, Lucas, because not only did I study under the great Dr. Craig Evans, the foremost biblical scholar in the English-speaking world, but I also had the chance to study as a visiting professor. I came in and would teach us during my grad studies. I took a couple courses with Dr. Gary Habermas. And if you haven't heard of Dr. Gary Habermas, he is the world's leading researcher on the resurrection of Jesus. And one of the things that Habermas always said was that he almost never uses the shroud when he's giving a talk to try to promote and to defend the authenticity of Jesus' resurrection, his death, his burial. He almost never brings up the shroud because it is still somewhat of a controversial artifact to talk about. Not everybody buys into it. And if you Google this, if you go on YouTube, you'll see all kinds of videos trying to proclaim that the shroud is in fact fake. So you don't need the shroud to show that we have good warrant to believe in the passion, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. However, if it is in fact authentic, and I think there is some even better reason to believe that now, then amazing. So Dr. Gary Habermas, Lucas, on his website, has a really nice article that he wrote in a journal some years ago, and it really talks about the 4 reasons that the shroud is in fact of great interest in terms of studying Jesus and what happened to him. And really there's 4 areas that are of they're commonly questioned that he talks about. Number 1 is the historicity of the shroud. Is it in fact of first century provenance? Is it from the time of Jesus? That's a big question. And the discoveries that were released this week really touch on that. We'll get into that. The second thing that's really important about the shroud is this: the relationship that the shroud has with the New Testament and the New Testament descriptions of the passion, death, and burial of Jesus, especially with the Jewish burial techniques that were in practice in Jesus' time. The third thing that we have to talk about is, who is the guy in the shroud? Is it in fact Jesus himself, or is it someone else? And then the fourth thing is the resurrection. What can the shroud tell us, if anything, about the resurrection? So this is a really good way to frame it. And let's talk about the first question, the question of historicity. Is it in fact historically viable that it is from the time of Jesus? There have been so many who have written, and Habermas mentions this, that there's no mention. Some say that there's no mention at all in any document, in any historical reference to the shroud before the Middle Ages, before the 13th or 14th century. And it's simply not the case. And he mentions a couple things. Number 1, there's a guy named Braulio of Seville in the 2nd century. I don't know if he was the barber of Seville, but anyways, he did write about the shroud. And then there was also a sermon that is in existence, from a homily, if you will, from the 2nd century, also talking about the shroud. Another thing is that we have to also understand is that many of the most famous paintings of Jesus throughout the centuries, including one that's known as the Pantocrator. You've probably seen that image. It's one of the more famous images of the face of Christ. There are a lot of images of Jesus from art that they're pretty much, you can actually map them with the face of the individual on the shroud, right down to bruises on the face, around the eyes and things like that. It's actually pretty incredible. It's almost like they were using the man on the shroud as a template for their images of Jesus. Now, why would they do that unless the shroud had some verisimilitude to it, if you will? And verisimilitude is again a $5 word, which means coherence with reality. And if this is legit, that makes perfect sense. Also, there's an early church tradition, and you might have heard this one, Lucas, that Thaddeus, one of the disciples of the Lord, took a cloth which had an image of the face of Jesus and took it to what is now modern day Turkey, a place called Edessa, the kingdom of Edessa. And it stayed there for several hundred years. And then it went to Constantinople. And then it made its way eventually to France and finally to Italy. And this is, in fact, exactly the pathway that people think the shroud took. It spent much time in France before finally winding up in Turin. So we have this, and then the other thing too. This is before the most recent discoveries, which I'm going to tell you about in just a second. Some years ago, there was a Swiss botanist by the name of Max Frey, Frei, and he looked at pollen that was found in the shroud. It's really interesting. He looked at pollen. 6 species of pollen at least were found on the linen cloth that were native to Palestine, to Roman Palestine, uh, the area of Israel, and it was from the 1st century, which is really interesting. Almost exclusively, you could only find this pollen in Israel, and so you can't find this in Constantinople. You can't find this stuff anywhere else. So the shroud hasn't been outside of France or Italy since about the 14th century. So where did this pollen from Israel get on the shroud? Well, it had to have been from some time before that. Really intriguing there. And then the way that the linen material in the shroud is woven together, also to Max Frey, it kind of when it's shown to textile experts, they also sort of seem to corroborate the fact that it's from the time of Jesus, plus or minus about 100 years. So that's intriguing. And here's another thing too, that you see in the image of the man in the shroud. There are coins that were placed over the eyes. Wherever this person was, when they were buried, there were coins placed over the eyes. And you say, that's kind of weird, that's kind of strange. That was a Jewish burial practice during Jesus' time. And because modern technologies have allowed us to enhance the image that's on the shroud, you can actually see that those coins that were covering the man's eyes were really minted. And you could look at Greek letters here that seem to indicate that's minted during the reign of Pontius Pilate, somewhere between the years of 29 and 32 AD. That's pretty incredible. Wow. That's pretty incredible. And so what about this new evidence, this stuff that's come out over the past week or so? Well, this is from this is from OSV News, and there's been a number of media outlets that have reported on this as well. There's been something called WAXS, capital letters, dating process. What that stands for is wide angle X-ray scattering. And I'm sure, Lucas, you saw some of the headlines about this. And so this sort of technology has helped determine that the shroud appears to date as being over 2,000 years old. This is pretty wild. So in 1988, by the way, there's a study that was done that said the shroud only goes back to 1350. But again, they were looking at material from around the edge that was added on later after a fire. So this is really interesting. This new Fox News is reporting this as well. And this new WAXS technology, wide-angle X-ray, certainly seems to indicate the age of the shroud. So, Lucas, there's just a little bit of background on that, but there's more. But if you want to jump in here for a second.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there's still, if it were true that this was just kind of a medieval forgery and it was kind of a set conclusion, that there's still this intrigue surrounding it, and why are people so interested in studying it, and I don't know anything about wide angle X-ray technology.
Me neither.
But it sounds really cool. So it sounds pretty legit. And the fact that this is kind of showing, hey, this is actually older is, seems pretty indisputable.
Yeah. Another thing that's interesting about the shroud too, Lucas, and you're listening to the Cale Clark Show, is that how the image got on the shroud, there's no scientific process known to man by which it happened. Now, there's some theories about how the image got there, and I'll tell you about what that is in just a second, but it's very similar in that regard to the tilma of Guadalupe, because again, there's no paint, there's no modern, it's not silk screening, of course. How did the image of Our Lady get on the tilma of Guadalupe? In the same way, we have this image of this man who has all the marks of the passion and crucifixion, the way Jesus was crucified, which is, by the way, a very unique way to crucify someone. We'll talk about that in just a minute. but it's a photographic negative. That's the other interesting thing about the image. There's no first century technology by which you could imprint a photographic negative on a linen cloth.
Yeah.
That is just wild. But let's talk really quickly about the burial and Jewish burial practices at the time of Jesus. And Habermas talks about this in his research on the shroud as well. One of the things that we hear about in the gospel, and not just with regard to the burial of Jesus, but also with the case of Lazarus in John's Gospel, chapter 11. Remember, Lazarus, Jesus' friend, is buried, and Jesus raises him from death. He doesn't resurrect him. He resuscitates him. Lazarus is going to die again. But both in John chapter 11, verse 44, it talks about a napkin placed around the head. And then we have this again in John chapter 20, talking about a similar napkin placed around the head of Jesus. And it actually says in John chapter 20, verse 7, that this cloth was wrapped or rolled up. So we have this idea that there's a napkin that also maybe covered the face. Not necessarily. It may have, in fact, been, as the text indicates, wrapped around the head, but in a different way than most people think, wrapped around the jaw. Now, why would that be the case? Because when rigor mortis sets in, you don't want the jaw to be hanging wide open. We still do this today, by the way, in funeral homes. I've been backstage, if you will, at funeral homes as part of my studies. And I met with funeral home directors. And of course, what they do is with the bodies, before they're presented to, if there's an open casket, they wire the jaw shut. You don't want to come in there. And the corpse is gaping with its mouth open. No, you don't want that. Not cool. So they wire the jaw shut. Well, in the same way, the Jews would wrap this napkin around the jaw of the person who is being buried in order to keep the jaw shut. So that's what that is for. Kind of interesting there. The other thing there, too, is when you look at the shroud, whoever this person is, their body was not washed before burial, which was a custom of the Jews, to wash the body. Now, why would Jesus' body not have been washed? It's really a couple reasons for that. Number one, you can probably think of this right away, Lucas. They've got to get the bodies off the crosses and buried before sundown, or else God will not accept the Passover sacrifice. That's one reason why. So there's a lot of haste involved. And that's why the legs of the two other victims of crucifixion that were killed alongside Jesus, their legs were broken to hasten death, so they can't push themselves up to breathe. What you die from on the cross, of course, is really asphyxiation. And Jesus was already dead, so they don't break his legs. They do give him the spear thrust to the heart, but they take down the body and they bury it without washing the body. But there's another reason for that. It's not just the haste, with which they had to do this, but there's also a Jewish law, in the code of Jewish law, that if you are guilty of a capital crime against the state, they would leave the blood on the body as almost a payment, if you will, for the crime against the government, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of intriguing as well. So that's another reason why the body of Jesus probably wasn't washed, because you still see, of course, the blood stains on the shroud. So kind of interesting there.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm just thinking as you're talking, Cale, like all these different things that kind of point towards this first century Jewish man who was crucified and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, the interesting thing is that, like, even if, to your point that you made earlier that Gary Habermas makes, like, even if let's just for argument's sake say, you know what, in 10 years from now something turns up and proves all of it was completely false, completely fabricated, it still wouldn't take away or diminish the reality of the resurrection, or the evidence, the best evidence for the resurrection. But this does support and lend insight into what that would have looked like. And the other thing too is, like, I feel like a lot of people that do these studies on the shroud probably have like a motive one way or the other to either prove or disprove it. But at the end of the day, you got to let the evidence speak for itself. In any scientific inquiry, you got to be objective and just look at the facts. And these facts seem to be pointing towards at least a first century Jewish man who was crucified by the Roman government. And was it Jesus or not? You know, I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you're going to say about the resurrection piece. But anyway, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, no kidding. And as you said, Lucas, if it does prove to be an incredibly sophisticated forgery, it wouldn't hurt our case for Jesus at all. However, there's some really good reason to believe that this, in fact, is the burial shroud of Jesus. So we looked at a couple of things earlier. Just want to point out one other thing that Habermas mentions in his piece, which is this. Some people assume that when Jesus was wrapped up for burial, that he was wrapped like an Egyptian mummy, strips, of linen around. And there is, of course, a couple of terms in the gospel in Matthew 27:59, Luke 23, verse 53, that talk about the linen wrappings or him being wrapped or the linen being folded, but it's not that specific about exactly how it was done. And in fact, there are lots of Jewish examples of the type of burial that is depicted in the shroud. The Essenes, who were a group of Jews, there are many groups within Judaism, of course, at the time of Jesus. One of them was known as the Essenes. They were the guys who lived in the Dead Sea caves. There's an Essene cemetery that was unearthed, and some persons were found there buried like the individual in the shroud. The Code of Jewish Law, also Habermas says, states that the person killed should be buried in a single plain sheet of linen. So again, they're not wrapped up like a mummy necessarily. And in fact, even Lazarus, when he comes forth from the tomb, as Habermas says, he walks out. When Jesus calls him forth, he comes out. So he couldn't have done that really unless he was shuffling somehow, wrapped up like a mummy, like you might see in Scooby-Doo. All right. So at any rate, just a little Scooby-Doo reference. But yeah, anyways, that's just a kind of a side piece there. But let's talk really quickly about whether or not the person in the shroud could be Jesus. What are the odds that it is Jesus? And it was somebody for sure. But as Habermas notes, when you look at the depictions of the Passion in the New Testament, and you compare it to the shroud and the man who was buried in it, this was a guy who had a number of wounds consistent with how the Passion is described. Wounds on the scalp, consistent with a quote unquote crown of thorns. And by the way, the crown of thorns might not have been like a circular crown with nothing on top. It was probably like a cap, if you will, that was woven together by the soldiers and put over his whole head. There are a number of wounds on the scalp. There are also blows to the face, which can be seen in the individual in the shroud, large bruises on the cheeks and forehead. I'm quoting from Habermas here. A twisted nose, one eye swollen half shut, and a cut upper lip. And very clearly over his body, front and back, he was beaten with the flagellum, the Roman flagrum. And this is, of course, also known as the Cat of Nine Tails. If you saw the movie The Passion of the Christ, which I'm sure you did, which came out, I think, in 2004, obviously the toughest scene to watch is the flogging of Christ and the scourging at the pillar. And as Mel Gibson said, in interviews afterwards, he said the audience must suffer. And you do really enter into that suffering. But many people thought that Mel Gibson went way over the top in his depiction of the flogging. I don't think he did. There are many accounts from the times of Jesus about criminals who died simply from the flogging, from massive blood loss. And that's probably one of the reasons why Jesus died so quickly on the cross. He'd already lost a high volume of blood to begin with. There are actually more than 120 whipping wounds on the man of the shroud. And it's everywhere except on his face, his forearms, and his feet. However, there's actually some dispute about this. There's actually kind of a wound to the right eye on the man of the shroud. So, some think it was from the whip, maybe a piece of bone or metal in the whip catching the eye, and it's swollen shut there. It might have also been from the crown of thorns. We don't really know for sure. But we do know this: whoever it was, this man of the shroud was forced to carry a heavy object across his shoulders after his beating. You can see large rub marks on the shoulder blades. And that, of course, smears the bloody wounds of the whipping underneath, as Habermas says. There are contusions on both knees, consistent with falls, which we, of course, remember every time we pray the way of the cross. There are 5 major wounds associated with death by crucifixion. There are, of course, puncture wounds through the wrists, and that is consistent with what we know of crucifixion in the Roman world, that the victim would be nailed through the wrists. Not always. Sometimes they were tied with ropes. If they were nailed through the hand, there would be ropes keeping the person on the cross. The hand's not strong enough to hold the person up, the weight. The spike would just tear through the hand. So there's the natural opening in the wrist bone, which they would often nail people through. And that's not a problem when you hear about the hands and feet of Jesus, the wounds in his hands and feet. The wrist is part of the hand in the Jewish world. It's kind of like, in basketball, when you block somebody's shot, if you hit their hand as well as the ball, the hand's part of the ball, if you will. Well, the wrist is part of the hand in the Jewish mindset when it comes to that. So that's not a problem at all. Puncture wounds through both wrists, through the tops of both feet. The person on the shroud has been pierced on his right side in the chest. There was a large amount of blood mixed with a watery liquid. We'll talk about that in just a second as well. So it's interesting that there's sort of some things that happened to this person who was buried in the shroud that also happened to Jesus, that didn't happen to all crucifixion victims. This is interesting. It's pretty rare that you'd find the victim of crucifixion who also had a crown of thorns placed on his head. The
I'm glad you
severe
actually
beating.
mentioned that, Cale, because I was wondering, like, I feel like like I said, I don't know a whole lot about the shroud, but I feel like I could hear somebody say, well, that happened to every crucifixion victim, and there were a lot of crucifixion victims, so why make all these unnecessary parallels that it has to be Jesus? Wouldn't that have been anybody that was crucified under the Roman government? But no, actually, it sounds like it's actually some unique things that are very particular to what Christ would have experienced. Not everybody would have experienced,
Exactly. And what's interesting, too, is that there are a couple of scientists, and Habermas mentions 2 University of Turin scientists, Tino Zueli and Bruno Barberis, and they concluded after their in-depth study that there was, get this, one chance in 225 billion that the man in the shroud and Jesus, that it's 2 different people. One in 225 billion that they're different persons. That's incredible. Now, some people have said they've been pretty skeptical about that number, but even other studies have arrived at a 1 in 83 million probability that the 2 men are not the same. So it's looking more and more likely that this is in fact the actual burial shroud of Jesus. So it got everything. It's got the spear wound in the chest, the crown of thorns, the flogging, legs are not broken, as often was the case with crucifixion victims. So there are a lot of points of comparison there. But there have been some new discoveries on that front as well. And this is another thing that came out very recently. There's, of course, the wide-angle X-ray technology that shows that the shroud is from the 1st century. But there's also a study that came out in July that revealed that a little bit more about the blood stains and the marks, the wounds, being consistent with the tortures endured by Jesus. And this is, in fact, a study that was done by Giulio Fanti, who's he's a professor, but he's also professor of mechanical and thermal measurements at the University of Padua. And the study was called New Insights on Blood Evidence from the Turin Shroud Consistent with Jesus Christ's Tortures. And I read a piece, and other outlets covered this as well, but this was from OSV News, and we'll put a link to this in the show notes, by the way. The study showed that there is the presence of creatinine, a substance called creatinine, not creatine, not what the bodybuilders take, although we should probably be taking that as well, but creatinine. Now, what is that? There were creatinine particles with ferritin that were found at the microscopic level in the shroud. Now, this happens when there are muscle contractions. This is released. Creatinine and ferritin. This confirms the kind of torture that Jesus suffered. And in the article, the shroud is referred to as the HST. And in Canada, we have something called the Harmonized Sales Tax, which we don't like, called the HST. That's not what we're talking. The HST stands for the Holy Shroud of Turin. And anyways, the evidence on the HST, the Holy Shroud, says that, quote, there are numerous bloodstains scattered throughout the double body image, because again, it's front and back, that show that this person was tortured. The bloodstain marks over the body image are consistent with pre-crucifixion flagellation. That's the scourging we talked about before. The bloodstain marks on the head are consistent with a crown of thorns. Blood marks on the hands and feet consistent with crucifixion. And the bloodstain on the chest evidences a post-mortem wound that corresponds with the post-mortem spear wound that Christ received as described in the Bible. Now, this is the part that I want to talk about, because this new study that just came out talks about a, quote, almost transparent substance between the blood-stained threads of the shroud. It is a semi-transparent fluid, and this could, in all likelihood, be the same type of fluid that's produced by a pulmonary edema. Now, this happens when you have an excessive accumulation of fluid in the lungs, and there's also a condition that's not mentioned here, but it's called a pericardial effusion. This is sort of a sac that can build up around the heart, that also a fluid that forms around the heart when it's under great stress, and the type of stress that Jesus would have been under during the crucifixion. When we look at John chapter 19, we get the famous blood and water passage. I just want to read this to you really quickly. John 19, starting at verse 31. Since it was the day of preparation, in order to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, and this, of course, means the Jewish religious authorities asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But, this is verse 34, John 19, this is the key verse, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not a bone of him shall be broken. And again, another scripture says, they shall look on him whom they have pierced. So this blood and water, in all likelihood, it's actual blood, but then there is this fluid, this semi-transparent fluid, which is consistent with a pulmonary edema or a pericardial effusion, if you will. But it would have looked to, as an observer, and we've got obviously what's claiming to be eyewitness testimony here in the Gospel of John, it would have looked to the naked eye like blood and water gushing out of his side. And of course, we would say there's a sacramental angle to this as well, representing baptism, the water, quote unquote, the blood of Christ representing the Eucharist. And this is the church being born from the side of Christ, just as Eve, the bride of the first Adam, was extracted from the side of the first man. The second Adam, Jesus, as St. Paul calls him, his bride, also issues forth from his side. So it's a very famous image in the Church Fathers.
So you're saying that the new evidence, the new finding is that this blood, or this, I should have paid more attention in anatomy class in high school. I'm like, I don't even know what these parts are. But you're saying that this blood was on the cloth, and that was like kind of confirming the blood in the water.
Exactly. Yeah, they found this fluid mixed in with blood in the fibers of the shroud. So it's just another piece of the puzzle. And I just want to mention one thing about that. This is the article that talks as well, by the way. Giulio Fanti's study on the shroud talks about the right eye of the person who was buried in the shroud. He says it was, quote, more sunken with a vertical mark over the apparently furrowed eyelid, which indicates he could have been blinded by a blow by the scourge on the head. And again, this wound could also be consistent with a thorn, the crown of thorns being roughly shoved onto the head of our Lord. So when you put it all together, it makes a pretty compelling case that we've got even more evidence that not only is the shroud legitimately from the first century, from the time of Christ, with the X-ray, wide-angle X-ray technology report that was released, but also the pollen, the first century pollen native to Israel, and so many other factoids that the way that this person was crucified, the fact that ancient images of Christ were using the shroud to map them out as painters were working, as artists were conceiving these images. It all makes too much sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, Cale. I'll be transparent here, and uh, of course, I've heard about the shroud since I've been a Catholic, but it's never been a thing that's really captivated me too much. I've just been kind of like I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, maybe not. Um, and just hearing about it, I've always been kind of skeptical. Like, I don't know. That means it seems like people are kind of just trying to find more evidence to believe, and it's not really that legit. But I've got to say, like, when you do add all of these things together, I mean, and these are scientists, these are medical people that are making these, even a botanist who is
Yeah,
making
exactly.
these studies. You can't really like who am I? I'm not a scientist or a medical person or a botanist. Like, who am I to say that what they're finding is not true? So it seems to be pretty good cumulative evidence that it's indicating that this, in fact, uh, is likely that it could have very well been the burial cloth of Christ. And that's just really fascinating that this
Yeah,
exists, you know?
it does. Like, there does seem to be a series of converging and convincing arguments, if you will, that uh, make it likely that it is, in fact, not only an authentic artifact, but it is, in fact, the burial cloth of Christ. But again, as we've been saying all along, we don't need it to prove the resurrection or to give good
Right.
warrant for the resurrection. It may or may not be something you'd want to bring up with a skeptic, but there is an awful lot of interest around the shroud, no doubt. But let's just talk really quickly about the two elements in the shroud that do maybe have something to say about the resurrection. Because you say, well, hang on here. If this is a burial cloth, what does this have to do with the resurrection? It really has to do with how the image got on the cloth. Because again, there's no first century technology known to man by which a photographic negative image like this could appear on the cloth. So how did it get there is the question. And there have been some theories proffered. There was a team of scientific researchers that examined the shroud in 1978. And the head of radiology of the UCLA medical department said that he believes that the image on the shroud was caused by a radioactive scorch, which is kind of intriguing because when you think about the resurrection and the kind of power that would have been unleashed, if you will, you can just imagine, and there's movies, Easter movies, where there's a light coming out from behind the stone, and all that stuff. I don't know exactly what would have taken place, but this is an unbelievable release of power. And maybe as he passed through, and obviously the corporal, physical, resurrected body of Jesus had the ability to pass through objects. It seems like he's appearing in locked rooms. Maybe as he kind of goes through the shroud, he leaves this image behind as an imprint, if you will. Well, this is what Habermas says. He says, quote, "There is much evidence that indicates that the image was caused by a burst of light and or heat." And this is very intriguing additional evidence possibly for the resurrection. But again, you'd have to add this to the historical evidence that we already have. And the second thing he says here, and this is interesting. I hadn't thought of this before. The person who was in the shroud did not decompose. That person, that they did not decompose, because if you had a person who, even if they'd had all these wounds, been crucified, if they'd been buried for some time and the body was decomposing, the marks of decomposition would also be left on the image. We don't have that with the Shroud of Turin. The body was probably in the cloth for no more than a very few days. So the fact that the body of this person in the shroud didn't decompose, it just adds to the intrigue. And Habermas says, if it's not Jesus, we might have another problem here. It might be that another guy rose from the dead, if this isn't Jesus. So what seems more likely here? To me, I don't know. I just think it seems like the balance of evidence is tilting heavily towards this being, in fact, the burial garment of Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. And there's still, I'm sure, some mystery surrounding it for sure. But this is some very intriguing evidence that does make it seem like this could be it. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see if upon these new studies, if people are going to be like, oh, I want to do some more studies now on this
Yeah,
to try and
exactly.
like continue to uh, investigate it and look at it.
Hmm.
And yeah, it'll be interesting.
And it's kind of cool that the church allows this kind of research to happen as well,
Yes,
because
yeah, it's a good point.
building on something you said earlier, I think a lot of these scientists they don't have any kind of axe to grind either way. They're just looking at this using the scientific method. And it kind of reminds me of other studies that were done in the 1970s when Pope Paul VI allowed secular scientists to examine the Eucharistic miracle at Lanciano, Italy,
Mm,
and have at it, guys, and you tell us what you think. And the researchers came back and said, well, this looks like tissue from a human heart, expertly dissected. It has all the properties of living tissue.
yeah,
This is amazing. This is not, the church didn't tell them to say that.
right.
And again, this does, these Eucharistic miracles are not what we rely on to believe that the Eucharist is true. We rely on the teaching of Christ, the word of Christ. But we do, hey, if these are found to be, there's nothing, in this world, there's nothing natural that can explain this, then that it's definitely something that a modern person, it kind of causes a raised eyebrow to happen there. There's no question about it. So
Yeah, it's interesting. I never really thought about that, but you're right. Like the fact that the church is even allowing these studies to happen is really cool because it's like if they, one, knew that it was a forgery,
mhm.
they wouldn't want to let people study it because then they would be found out. Or two, if they were like, well, or if they were just like afraid, like, well, what about if this disproves it and then like that could look really bad or whatever, and they're just like, no, go for it, guys, have at it, and the faith that it takes to be like, we're gonna let this happen, and we trust that like God's got this, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we got nothing to hide here. It's a very refreshing, and I think that we have to be like that whenever we're trying to explain and defend the faith. Whenever we're doing what's called
yeah,
apologetics, um, we have to, I think, do something called, as one writer said, we have to practice humble apologetics, and we could sort of say, well, I could be wrong about this, but it seems to me that the evidence is pointing in this direction. And this
yeah,
seems to be the best explanation for the facts that we have. Um, that's not triumphalistic at all, right? I mean, it's just, hey, we believe that this coheres with reality, and maybe we ought to take this seriously. So I love this new evidence for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. You're listening to the Cale Clark Show, and Lucas, one thing we also have to take note of at this time of year is that it is football season. Football season is upon us as we're recording this episode. College football
uh,
games are already in full swing. Lucas has been stealthily checking his phone under the table and making sure he's all paid up with his bookies. No, I'm only kidding. But I want to talk about an NFL story that's also kind of related to faith at a human level. It's a story of interest. And in the preseason, in the NFL preseason that just concluded, another big story that came out a few days ago was involving your very own Miami Dolphins. And tell us about this.
yeah. So Tua Tagovailoa, who was people were talking about him a lot over the summer, wondering whether or not the Dolphins were gonna extend his contract or let him go or trade him, and after much negotiating, they finally made a deal, which was exciting. And
Yeah.
by the way, Mike McDaniel just signed a contract extension
Yes.
a day ago. So I was really excited about that because I really like him a lot, and I think he's doing a really good job down there in Miami. But uh, Tua Tagovailoa was on the Dan Lebitard show, and
Yeah.
Dan Lebitard, for those of you who don't know, he is a sports journalist. and he covers all things South Beach, Miami sports.
Yeah.
And they were having a conversation, and Dan Lebatard asked him, like, how he's grown as an athlete over the last few years, and then he asked him what difference it's made having Mike McDaniel as a coach.
Yeah, let's check out this clip from Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa in conversation with Dan Lebatard.
If you woke up every morning and I told you you sucked at what you did, that you don't belong doing what you do, that you shouldn't be here, that this guy should be here, that you haven't earned this right, and then you have somebody else come in and tell you, dude, you are the best fit for this. Like, you are accurate, you are the best whatever, you are this, you are that. Like, how would it make you feel listening to one or the other? You see what I'm saying? And then you hear it, regardless of what it is, the good or the bad. And you hear it more and more, you start to actually believe that.
So this clip is super interesting to me because it just highlights the importance of the words that we use and how we can really, by what we say, either build someone up and speak life into them, or really kind of bring them down and put them into a negative space. And so I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts, Cale, as you kind of saw this happen in the news?
And by the way, the coach who had been tearing Tua down verbally was Brian Flores. In case we didn't mention that before, Brian Flores was the Dolphins head coach prior to Mike McDaniel taking over. Brian Flores is a very highly regarded defensive coach, was the defensive coordinator for the New England Patriots during some of their dynasty years under head coach Bill Belichick. And obviously he used an old school type of motivation. And this was, as ESPN reporter who covers the Dolphins and the NFL, Jeff Darlington, said recently on ESPN, the treatment of Tua, the franchise quarterback in Miami, what was a huge reason why. It's probably the reason why Brian Flores was let go as coach. And the relationship that Tua has now with Mike McDaniel, as he alluded to in the clip, is so much more positive. And I agree with you on every front there. And the words that we use, and of course, the word in general, of course, Jesus is the living word of God. The words that we use, the messages that we give to others, that we tell ourselves, are so crucial to get right. And I wanted to just share a scripture, which we're all familiar with, that I thought of immediately when I heard the story. And it's from, of course, the letter of James. And in James chapter 3, it talks about taming the tongue. He says, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, for you know that we who teach shall be judged with greater strictness. For we all make many mistakes. And if anyone makes no mistakes in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body also. If we put bits into the mouths of horses that they may obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So the tongue is a little member and boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is an unrighteous world among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the cycle of nature, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing, my brethren. This ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening fresh water and brackish? Can a fig tree, my brethren, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. And that's an incredible passage from James on the power of the tongue, the power of our words, and how hard it is to keep that under control.
Yeah. And so it's funny that James came into mind for you, but the first reflection I kind of had after listening to this was I thought of Barnabas. And
Mm.
in the Acts of the Apostles, we hear about Barnabas traveling with Paul a lot
Yeah.
in their kind of missionary journeys. And the name Barnabas means son of encouragement.
Right.
And there is a fascinating episode in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 9, verses 26 to 28. So this is right after Paul or Saul experiences Christ on the road to Damascus and has this conversion moment on the road to Damascus, and then is kind of reeling from this and trying to make sense of it all. And he's preaching in Damascus, and then he's wanting to go to Jerusalem. And it says, and when he, that is Paul, had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord, who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. So he went in and out among them at Jerusalem. So what I love about this is that Barnabas, if it wouldn't have been for Barnabas, who knows if Paul ever would have linked up with the apostles, with the disciples there in Jerusalem, and what would have happened. It took Barnabas kind of stepping in and saying, like, no, Paul is legit. Like, he's got it. You know, he's been preaching boldly in our name, and he's with us. He can do this. And I just think about, like, you know, how important it is to have people in your life who are willing to speak life into you, and to surround yourselves with good people who are going to be like, you know, you've got this. And who can just tell it to you straight too, like even when you're being stupid, who can just kind of be like, hey, you know, speak truth into your life, because that builds us up. And personally, I am like, I don't know if you've ever done the love languages thing, Cale. But
I know what they are. Do I always practice them? Not as much as I should.
Yeah, same here. Same here. But for me, I've always been like a words of affirmation person, and like I know like if somebody says something, like it can just really build me up. And so I just think that like what Mike McDaniel's been able to do with Tua has been great, and I'm excited for this football season, and hopefully the Dolphins will take the AFC East this year. We'll see.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mike McDaniel and Tua as well. Obviously, the two of them together. I mean, they've created offensive magic with Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, and all the weapons the Dolphins have. It's on the defensive side of the ball where there've been problems over the last 3 years. Of course, a new coordinator every year for the last 3 years. So we'll see what happens on that front. But there's no question that Tua is in a much better place because of the encouragement that he got from Mike McDaniel, who has been essentially a Barnabas figure to him. And we should probably tell our listeners too, just in case they don't know, when we refer to the love languages, there's a book called I think it's called The 5 Love Languages. I don't know what the actual title is, but it's by Gary Chapman. And the 5 love languages are just like, we all like all of these things, but some people kind of major in one or two of them. What's your dominant love language? So the love languages are words of affirmation. Lucas mentioned that. Physical touch, gift giving. I think, or they like people like to receive gifts is one thing. What else? What are the other ones? I'm drawing a blank
one
here.
of the other ones is quality time.
Quality time, yeah.
And what is the last one? I actually don't even remember.
Neither do I, which probably means we're not great at this. But I said that, so those are the 5 love languages, and we can Google them really quickly and find out what they are. But this whole episode also called to mind an interesting interview that I heard in another podcast. It was called the Knowledge Project podcast, hosted by Shane Parrish, who writes the very cool Farnham Street blog. And in this particular episode of the Knowledge podcast show, Shane Parrish interviewed a guy named Dr. Jim Lohr. Dr. Jim Lohr is a high-performance coach. He's written tons of books. He, in fact, was the co-founder of the Human Performance Institute. He's worked with elite athletes all around the world, including 17 number 1 ranked pro athletes in various sports, including tennis. And this was a really interesting episode because he talked about really the power of the tongue and the stories that we tell ourselves, and sometimes the stories that other people tell us. And you heard Tua say in the clip that I don't care who you are. I don't care how high up on the food chain you may be, socially speaking. If somebody tells you the same thing for 2 years straight, you're going to start to believe it. I don't care who you are. So these scripts that we hear, and very often the internal monologue that we have going on all the time, is just so crucial to get right. And in this episode, Jim Lohr talked about the fact that he has 3 sons, and as a dad, so all the parents out there listening, this is crucially important. As a dad, he wished he had realized this sooner, because we had this story going through our mind all the time. There's what we say publicly to other people out loud, and then there's what we tell ourselves, this internal story. And philosophers have noted this for a long time. And I remember the first time I read this, I didn't quite understand this at the time. This idea that everything that we know about the world comes to us through the senses. You probably heard about this, Lucas. You probably studied this. Through our 5 senses, that's how we apprehend reality. So whether it's our hearing, what we hear from people, what we touch, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, all that stuff, we don't have direct contact with the real world, quote unquote. It's all mediated through the senses. Like we do, but it's mediated through the senses, if that makes any sense. So we take in all this sense data, and then the big neuroprocessor up here has to make sense of it all. And Jim Lohr said the more that he understood this as a dad, he started to say, my goodness, the way that I've been talking to my 3 sons, I really, really have to take heed of that, because there are certain individuals in our lives, especially when we're very young and in our formative years. He says that their voice can bypass all of our defenses, and it goes right to the command center. And those voices and what we hear from these people are internalized right away. And a great example of that would be the voice of a parent, the voice of a mother, the voice of a father. What you're telling your children, it's going to bypass. With somebody else, maybe you might say, I'll take that with a grain of salt. But the parent's voice, especially when you're a kid, it goes straight, bypasses all those anti-malware, programs or whatever, and it gets directly incorporated. And he says that the public voice of the parent to the child becomes the private voice of the child in their internal dialogue. So, for example, if a parent says, why are you such a failure all the time? Why are you such a screw up? Why do you keep messing up? You're just worthless. You'll never amount to anything. That child, I guarantee you, is going to internalize that somehow. And that is not what you want. And so our brains are kind of always listening, and we have to really, really be careful about what we pour into other people's lives, and really kind of be aware of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and what we're capable of. And we know that as Catholics, we're capable of great sanctity. We're called to be canonizable saints. It's not just for other people. Like there should be a stained glass window of Lucas Holt in some parish someday.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, he's going to have his signature hoodie on or whatever, but I don't know. But maybe his skateboard and his Miami Dolphins hat. I don't know. But there's going to be, it's kind of like the Carlo Acutis motif, if you will. But this is really important to understand the stories we tell ourselves. And I wrote down a couple of quotes that Jim Lohr said in this program. He talked about a guy named James Pennebaker, who is a researcher at the University of Texas. And the question was really about, well, okay, if we recognize that we have a bad script in our head, like Tua had this really bad script in his head that was planted by Brian Flores, his coach, this authority figure that, you stink, you're not going to make it. I'd rather have anybody else a quarterback other than you. So how are you supposed to rewrite the script? One of the ways that this guy, James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, says to do it is through writing. He says you've got to write, because there's been all kinds of evidence about this kinetic connection between the hand and the brain. And I've heard this is true at a lot of private schools as well. They're getting away from a lot of the digital tech that's used in the classroom these days and getting people back to maybe what we grew up with, cursive writing, handwriting, writing down your notes. Because I don't know if you found this to be true, Lucas, but I certainly have in my life, that when you write something down by hand, your notes that you have by hand, if you'd want to draw your own diagrams, so even if it doesn't make sense to anybody else, it helps you to internalize and remember things. And so
Yeah.
what this guy Pennebaker says to do is you've got to start writing and journaling and sort of reframing and rewriting your script. You can reframe a situation in a much more positive way. If something, let's say you lose your job, and this has happened, to me, you lose your job, you could say, well, this is a disaster. My world's crumbling down. You could say, this is an opportunity. You can reframe it and say, no, I'm a survivor. Or what? That's a much better reframe than saying, the world's crashing in. Try to look at things positively. And so rewriting your inner dialogue about who you are, what you're capable of, what your story is, and then telling it to yourself. So he says, make a voice recording and read what you wrote in your journal and then play it back to yourself, internalize it. So it's kind of interesting. Like there's so many ways that we can do this as Catholics and say, I am a child of God. I'm a son of God. I'm a daughter of God. I am destined to live for eternity with him. I am destined to be a canonizable saint. Now, that might sound like arrogance. It's not, because God is the one who makes it happen. But just stuff like that. I just found that to be so interesting, and kind of that was a connection I made with this story.
I love that. I think it's great. As I was listening to you speak, Cale, I was reminded of this past week I listened to the newly released Out of Pocket with RG3 podcast.
Yeah.
So Robert Griffin III, former quarterback at Baylor and in the NFL, and was recently dropped by ESPN. Now he's doing his own thing, but he had Deion Sanders on his show, who's now
I heard about that
at Colorado, and by the way, they beat North Dakota State. Their opening game. I love watching. I'm not a Colorado fan, but I have to say that they're a very fun team to watch. But anyway, it was a really interesting podcast because Deion Sanders obviously has sons who play on Colorado.
Yes, that's right.
And they were talking a little bit about fatherhood in the podcast, and Sanders faces criticism sometimes from people saying, "Oh, you're playing your sons because they're your sons," or whatever, and
nepotism.
And anyway, so he was asked, like, what would you say to a child of yours, like if they're growing up and they're playing sports or whatever? He said, "You don't have to be the best, but you got to do your best.
Yeah,
you got to put forth your best." And I love that because I'm just like, I feel like especially in today's culture, kids are under so much pressure from their parents to perform well in school, in sports, or whatever. Yeah. And it's like, you don't have to be the best, but you got to do your best. And I really like that a lot. And it's interesting, what you were saying about the script that a kid will tell themselves from their parents. And I'm just thinking of myself as a dad with a 2-year-old. Like, I really gotta watch the words that I use when I'm talking to my son, like that. Right. I'm speaking life into him and still disciplining him. Yeah. But having the opportunity as his father to speak life into him and to be a positive role model and somebody that he can look up to. It's a scary responsibility, but it's also really special and rewarding. So yeah, I don't know. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I love that, Lucas. And it's so true. And Jim Lohr in the podcast talked about Novak Djokovic, who many people feel, and you can argue about this, is maybe the greatest tennis player of all time. When he was first learning the game, he had a teacher, his first tennis teacher, and she noticed that of all the other kids in the group, like he just seemed to possess some really natural gifts, even at a very young age. And she told him that. She said, "Listen, I think you have incredible potential in this game." And just her saying that caused him to believe that. And the positive reinforcement. I think about Tiger Woods' dad, Earl, and obviously he had his issues, but one of the things that he always did was he instilled a belief in Tiger. I mean, he would say things like, "Let the legend grow," and things like that. And Tiger really bought into this. And I think that his dad really gave him the confidence to really go for it and believe, yeah, it can be great. And this idea of always doing your best, that's really all we can ask. Okay, so we looked up what the last of the 5 love languages are, and it's acts of service. And the fact that we didn't know that, like I said, maybe means that we're not so great at that. But we'll ask our wives. No, we don't want to ask our wives. We don't want to know the uncomfortable truth. But having said that, we're doing this podcast as a service to humanity, are we not? Yeah, there we go. But what you were saying earlier too about Lucas about trying your best. That also reminds me of a book called The Four Agreements. I talked about this once on Relevant Radio, and it's a book of Toltec spirituality, which I do not buy into at all. But having said that, the concepts of the book and what the Four Agreements are, we can easily apply those to the Catholic life. And they are as follows. By the way, Tom Brady was really into this book too at a crucial point in his career. Number one, be impeccable with your word. We talked about in this episode the power of the word. Of course, Jesus is the Word of God incarnate. The idea that our words carry weight and we should mean what we say. We should take care with what we say, and we should do what we say we're going to do. So be impeccable with your word, number one. Number two, never make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. We can save ourselves a lot of grief just by following this one. The third one is never take anything personally. Never take anything personally. When horrible things are done to us, it often has nothing to do with us. When people disagree with us, it's all about that other person. They're acting from their own hurts and weaknesses and maybe lack of formation that they didn't get growing up, whatever. It's not about you at all in most cases. And then the last one is always do your best. And your best is going to vary from day to day. If you're not feeling well, if you're under the weather, if you didn't get enough sleep the night before, you're stressed out about different things, there are various constraints. As long as you're doing your best, and you know what that is, you know whether you've given it the old college try, if you will, when you look in the mirror at the end of the night. That's it. And I love that. I love those 4 agreements, and we can easily incorporate those.
So it's funny because I thought about that very first one that you mentioned. There's in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 36. It says that, I'm paraphrasing here, but it says essentially every idle word that you speak, you will be held accountable for on the day of judgment. And that is a haunting verse. I'm just always like, wow. Yeah, every single word we use matters. Yeah,
that's right. And there are several listening devices out there, whether it's Alexa or even Siri. Well, God is definitely recording everything that we're saying. There's no question about that. And that's
an interesting thought. God is recording what we're saying. I don't want to hear the playback at the gates. I don't want to hear the playback.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hope that gets erased. And but no, it's a sobering thought for sure, especially in the age of social media. What we say online, we can try to hide behind a keyboard, but that counts too. And but anyway, so just lots to think about. The power of words to encourage, to build up, to tear down.
Yeah,
got to be so cognizant of the scripts that we give ourselves and others. So I think we'll leave it there, Lucas. We covered a lot of ground here in this episode of the Cale Clark Show. I want to remind everybody to tell a friend about the program. Share this episode. Use the share tools if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or on YouTube Podcasts. If you are watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button as well. Go to caleclark.com, C-A-L-E, Clark with an E.com, and you can sign up for the email list. We'll let you know first whenever new episodes appear and any other awesome news that we've got for you. So for producer Lucas Holt, this is Cale Clark signing off. Take it away, Michaela.
Thank you for listening to my daddy.